News Meet. Where did that come from? Okay, it's a Thursday. But this is a brand new slot on Newsbeat we're introducing. We're going to be calling it African Mirror. And our good friend, Dr. Paul Kariuki, will be on the other end of the line. Of course, Dr. Paul Kariuki hails from the University of KwaZulu, Natal, and he's convener of the Africa Policy Circle and is the guru on matters Africa. But I do believe Dr. Kariuki is online. Dr. Paul Kariuki, welcome to Newsbeat.
Thank you so much, Shafiq, for having me on the show, and good afternoon to your listeners.
Today we are just going to focus on the upcoming Africa-China summit, and of course President Ramaphosa having visited China. I don't know whether he's come back yet, but a whole entourage going to China. My sort of first take on this is an interesting assertion in a sense of the global south, isn't it? This obviously, to me, is indicating quite a shift in the focus of Africa, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa.
Indeed, you are very correct on that part, because there has been a competition for access to African raw materials for a long period now. It's not even just start now. And Africa, sadly, is a playground for all these global forces that seem to see something that we don't see for ourselves as an African continent. One of the issues is that we are asking them to come and help us invest in raw materials, for example, that we own as a continent, but we do not have the capacity to process, so that we can be able to negotiate our trading and practice on the global trading platforms to our disadvantage. The second thing is that we have also failed to create a competitive African voice that can be able to create a conducive for bilateral cooperation between the continent and China. Even as we see the formation and the format that this summit is taking place, Chinese government, with its wisdom and witness over our continent, is that they've invited African countries on one-on-one basis. They have not invited African Union, for example. They have invited African countries on the basis of one-on-one, because it's easier to negotiate their advantage at that level rather than negotiating at a union level. And that is to our advantage, because it raises other questions around what, for example, would happen to the African free trade agreement opportunity if still African countries are negotiating as individual countries with these, serious global competitor. And that is one of the challenges that we see. Even on the surface, it looks like it's a good thing to do, and that Africa is still getting, more and more into this competitive space of negotiating her place, in the global trading and other advancement, platforms. But to whose advantage? And that's the biggest question.
It certainly is. I'm glad you're asking it, because as you were talking, I was thinking about the Africa Free Trade Agreement. Surely it's in China's interest to actually encourage it, because if sub-Saharan Africa in particular, if the SADC region can up the game economically and infrastructurally, it's China as well who is going to benefit far more from a country that's got good infrastructure as opposed to a country that struggles to get goods to market.
That's the thing. And of course, to a great extent, from the experience that we have seen over the last 3 or so decades of China's investment on the continent, on one part to give them, a benefit of doubt, because we've seen certain levels of infrastructural development would not have happened in our countries if it was not for that kind of involvement, bilateral involvement. However, we must also not shy away to say some of the investment that has happened on the continent has not been on the benefit of the African people. And country cases are all over, where you can pick certain things that have happened in these individual countries that have not beneficiated either the local community or the entire nation as such, in terms of the balance of trade. For example, taking a case of South Africa, our president followed one of the discussions he has had so far at the summit, and is trying to force the notion that there must be a trade balance between South Africa and China. The opposite is true, that we've been living in an imbalanced situation where we are not beneficiating maximally to our advantage as a nation because of the trade imbalances. So this is just one example. Many African countries have their own, case studies where they have not been able to maximize their relationship even at a bilateral level. Because don't forget that China is a very strong negotiator.
Oh, yes.
They do not let it pass. It has to be to their advantage. And if it means throwing down on you as a nation, they will do exactly that. But also the other danger that I need to mention quickly is what I'm calling debt diplomacy. What we don't hear often in most of these discussions, even when the summit concludes, it's what money have we agreed on per country. And what does it mean? What is the implication of that agreement to the country's economic welfare and its future, and even boiling it down to citizen level? How much are they going to cost? How much are the citizens going to cost in terms of taxes to pay back? Because China does not give money for free.
Yeah.
So whatever money has been agreed and whatever investments that have been agreed on the surface level, it looks like it's something wonderful and something to celebrate. But we don't boil down to the details of the contract. What have we committed as a nation so that we can get this money in return? What is the implication of our future economic progress as a nation? Because these are not your 1 or 2, 3 loans. You're talking of things that go up to 40, 50, sometimes even 100 years, leases. So you've seen in certain countries where China has gone actually to negotiate to take back national assets because countries have not been able to pay the debt. So the debt trap, which I'm calling diplomacy debt, it's one of those things that we do not hear a lot in these summits. And it seems our leaders know about them. Of course, they know what they're committing to. But it's not public knowledge available for engagement. Because if there's too much engagement around that, it confuses our political leaders on how they're going to negotiate because it makes it problematic. And we saw some country, I think it was Uganda 2 days ago, where certain groups of society existence, I think it's some civil society groupings, went to demonstrate, outside the Chinese embassy because of some of the commitments that the government is making there that will impact Ugandans negatively for probably 50 years to come.
Yeah.
Generations yet unborn will be forced to pay for a loan that never even knew why it was taken in the first place. So it's those kind of things, the secrecy around commitments, and of course the lack of sufficient public engagement with the loan agreements, because those things do impact, and they're impacting different African countries severely, and much of that is happening behind closed doors.
Of course, you mentioned the trade balance question, and of course we buy more from China than we export to them. What are your views? I mean, I think South Africa is quite right in insisting on a trade balance, because surely if there is a trade balance, that can not nullify, but it can make sure that at least the playing fields have a little bit of equality in them.
That's very true. And I think this is South Africa has demonstrated the courage that has been missing in these conversations for too long. And that's the courage to call out, the Chinese counterparts when things like this happen, to say, look, we are interested in doing business with you, but can we also level the playing ground so that it's all benefit for everyone mutually. And so I wish we can see much of that courage from other African countries that can be able to call out for this kind of discussion, especially where trade is concerned, because it's of the primary interest. For example, China is interested with the raw materials from our continent. That is the number one thing they need because of their demand for growth of the economy and the role they are playing in the other parts of the world in terms of the impetus of trade. But what we are not doing so well with this kind of negotiation is that while we're transporting our raw materials, we're exporting our raw materials for almost nothing compared in terms of the revenues that come back to the continent and to the individual countries, plus the demands that China will put on us as a continent or even individual countries in return for defaulting to pay. Because we have a chronic problem. The rates of defaulting are very high. So if we are negotiating trade, we need to negotiate in a way that is actually not only just beneficial, but also profitable. Because this is a business, and it has to be seen in that light. But I see, and I do not understand the hesitations from some of these African countries to call them out and say, if we are giving you X amount of trade, we are expecting on a minimum X in return for the same, at least match dollar to a dollar. But now that's not what happens in this case. And this is where South Africa delegation led by President Ramaphosa has taken the first step that is very bold. I've not heard of any other country that has made that bold calling in their discussions yet. Maybe we're going to see after the summit is over and we're going to get some reports to read. But it's the only country so far that I've heard that made that bold call out, say that we really want to see a trade balance and not an imbalance.
No, absolutely. And I agree with you, because the other thing about a trade balance is that when we export goods with dollar value, not yen value. And obviously, yes, with the dollar being pretty high, it offsets so much via exports as opposed to imports. And I think that perhaps to both of us is a kind of like a sober reminder of what we're talking about, is that this trade balance thing, I think, is absolutely key to what we're discussing.
It is, and it would be a pity if African countries that were invited to the summit will come out of that summit without such concrete agreements on the way forward in terms of this, China-Africa cooperative initiative, because it will mean that it will continue to perpetuate the underdevelopment that we're still seeing in most countries on the continent. And secondly, it will tie us into disadvantage right from day one, because it will mean once the summit is over, the agreements cannot be reviewed again. What you have committed is what's going to work out in terms of actualizing the MOU, the actual memorandum of understanding with different countries. So this means to me that we have a challenge as a country and as a continent if we're not going to get Beijing to agree to this level of high level commitment that is actually mutually beneficial in terms even of trade, but also in terms of internal infrastructure development, because that's what China is interested in most. The idea of infrastructure development looks good on paper, and we've seen, it makes things look better and feel better. But the pain that comes with the cost of that investment is the one that we don't speak often because of lack of transparency.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They always say that the devil is in the details. We don't get sufficient details to really think about what does this mean long term for the continent. And I can tell you before the year ends, there will be probably the U.S. president, whoever will come the president, might call another Africa-U.S. summit.
Yeah.
to get almost a match, in terms of offerings, because they are watching. And we might also have, in the beginning of the year, the Russia-Africa summit being called again, because they also want a piece of the pie. We have to get as a continent to a place where we can talk from one page. And even though bilateral agreements are not exclusively bad, but we must also get to a place where we can negotiate for the benefit of the continent and not for the benefit of individual countries.
Absolutely. Dr. Paul Kariuki, Africa Policy Center, University of KwaZulu Natal. Great to hear you back on the airwaves again. And until next week, we'll talk more about African affairs.